Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for a Pearson-sponsored webinar, Exploring the Measurement of Silent Reading Fluency. My name is Carissa Reedy. I'm facilitating this session from our Pearson office in Austin, Texas. Before we begin, I'd like to point out a few housekeeping items. First, you have a control panel located on the right-hand side of your screen. The orange arrow, top left, allows you to hide or expand this control panel. The round blue button allows you to move to full screen mode and back. Your control panel also has audio options. You're able to listen to the audio portion of this webinar through either your computer speakers or your telephone. Since we are recording today's session, all lines have been automatically muted. Next, please note that you have the ability to adjust the way the items on your screen appear. Use the Layout drop-down at the top left of your monitor to make adjustments to your preference. To participate in the question segment, please type your question in the question box on your control panel and click Send. Feel free to send in questions at any time. I will be moderating throughout the duration of the webinar. Also, please note that we have the PowerPoint slides available for you to download during the presentation. You can find these on your control panel under the Handout section. With that said, I'm so happy to introduce our presenters for today, Dr. Elfrieda Hebert and Dr. Mark Daniel. Dr. Elfrieda Hebert is a literacy expert and the president of Text Project, Inc. She has had a long career as a literacy educator. From teacher's aide to teacher of primary level students, and then to teacher, educator, and researcher at the universities of Kentucky, Colorado Boulder, Michigan, and California, Berkeley. Her research, which addresses how fluency, vocabulary, and knowledge can be fostered through appropriate texts, has been published in numerous scholarly journals and books. Dr. Mark Daniel has spent more than 30 years working with assessments in both the test development and psychometric areas, and currently works as a senior scientist for research and innovation. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I will turn it over to Dr. Daniel now.
Hello, and thank you very much for attending this session. We're going to be talking about the concept of silent reading fluency with comprehension. And the first half of the session, I will present something about the measurement of silent reading fluency with comprehension, the new measure that is part of AIMS-Web, and tell you something about how it works and its psychometric properties and some of the information that it has unearthed. The second section will be Dr. Hebert talking about the issue of really focusing on the comprehension side of this measurement. What does it mean to comprehend while you are reading silently with fluency? And what can we learn from this measure or from the research literature about that construct? So let me begin with telling you about the silent reading fluency measure. First of all, fluency is defined by the National Reading Panel in their 2000 report as the ability to recognize words easily, read with greater speed, accuracy, and expression, and better understand what is read. Oral reading fluency is, as you know, the most frequently used method of assessing reading fluency, and it's the number of words read correctly in 1 minute. It has many very powerful benefits. It's sensitive to growth, it's quick, it's very reliable, it correlates relatively highly with measures of reading comprehension, and it permits the examiner to get an evaluation of the student's accuracy as well as their prosody. However, it does have some drawbacks. It does use examiner time. It does not require that the student comprehend, even though they have to attend. They don't necessarily have to comprehend what they're reading. It involves an oral motor performance and coordination between the visual and the motor activities. It's less predictive at higher grade levels than at elementary levels. And perhaps most importantly, it is not what older students and adults actually do when they're reading, which is to read silently with comprehension. And this is what they need to be able to do in order to be successful in school. So the need, as we saw it about 4 years ago when this particular development project began, is to develop a measure of comprehension-based silent reading rate that provides the benefits of oral reading fluency in an authentic way. So these are the objectives of our development process. We wanted to measure the rate of reading grade level material with broad comprehension, that is, essentially getting the general meaning of what they've read. This is not about inference at a detailed level. It's not about comparing texts or the more sophisticated aspects of reading comprehension as outlined in CCSS. This is about getting a general understanding of what you are reading. It should resemble actual silent reading. It should be computer administered in order to be efficient. It should be reliable, valid, and sensitive to growth, as ORF are. And it should be brief. And being brief is especially important if it is to be used in progress monitoring. So AIMSweb's silent reading fluency is the result of that developmental effort. And essentially, the way it works is that the student reads something on screen. When the student is ready, when they're satisfied that they have understood what they read, they go on to the next screen. And there they see a very simple multiple choice question which they have to answer without looking back at the text. The questions are very easy, and if the student really got a general sense of what they read, they should be able to answer the question correctly. So ideally, the questions would be answered correctly by virtually all students. The reason for having the question is to make the student attend while they are reading, because they don't know what they're going to be asked about. They need to attend to what they are reading and extract meaning from the passage. The score on the silent reading fluency test is the rate of reading the segments. That is, the number of words on the screen that they read divided by the amount of time that they spent on that screen before they went ahead to the question. Now, the score is only meaningful if the student had a minimal level of accuracy on the questions, because if they didn't, then they were not reading with comprehension. Here's an example of how this works. I'll skip over the instructions, but basically the instructions can give some sample items and convey the notion the students should move through this as quickly as they can while understanding. So this is the first segment. So a student would see this on the screen. When they are ready, they click Next, and they have this question. They'll choose their answer, and they get feedback, which flashes for about 1 second on the screen before they move to the next segment. This is the next segment of that same story. Again, when they're ready, they click Next, choose their answer, get feedback. And at the end of the 4 segments, which make up a story, they get overall feedback on how many of the 4 questions they answered correctly, and some encouragement to try to get at least 3 of the 4 questions correct on each story that they read. And they'll read a total of 3 stories in this test. Just so you'll see, what you just saw was a grade 4 story. This is a grade 8 story, the first segment. Okay, so that's a general notion of how the test is administered and how it's scored. I want to say a little bit about how it was developed. It started with the concept of showing something on the screen, letting the student control the amount of time that they had to read that, and then having them answer a question about that after the screen had disappeared, so they could not go back and reread the segment. We did a number of pilot studies with various kinds of content and also various kinds of administration formats and various kinds of scoring. And these pilot studies were done one-on-one using paper materials where the examiner watched the student turn the page and recorded their times and their accuracy. And what this indicated was that even in these small pilot studies with relatively crude materials, that the rate of reading was highly reliable, about 0.9, across different sets of segments, and also correlated around 0.7 with standard either state or summative reading tests. We also found that the best type of content was a story in segments. We experimented with true-false statements, with other kinds of complex sentences, and came to the conclusion, based on feedback and also data, that a set of segments that went together into a story was the most effective method. We tried this at grade 2 and found that at that grade, even in the spring of grade 2, that students were not really engaging in the task in the same way as older students because they were focusing on decoding. They would often read aloud even though we had told them that they should not, and they were often incorrect on the questions, so that they were not really focusing on comprehension. And finally, we determined that giving feedback, correct, incorrect, after each question worked best at getting students to attend. So this is the general layout of the silent reading fluency test. The student reads several stories, each of which is broken into 4 segments, with a question following each segment. The questions are all, the stories are all leveled by reading maturity metric, and we give feedback after each question and also after each story. Why are the segments the length that they are? They're about 40 to 45 words per segment. That decision was based on our feeling that we wanted to have many independent observations. For general measurement accuracy, it's good to have many opportunities for the student to demonstrate their ability, and therefore get many independent pieces of data that give you a more accurate and valid piece of information. And a second reason was to minimize the amount to which memory of a lengthier passage might affect performance, since the students can't go back. Why give feedback? Encourage the students to pay attention. And in that way, we hope to let the students self-monitor their pace and slow down if they need to. We did a tryout at grades 4 to 8. The scoring of the test is based on, as I mentioned earlier, the number of words that the students read on a screen divided by the number of seconds that they spent looking at that screen before going to the question, times 60, giving a words per minute, and then taking a median of those screen words per minute to get an overall story words per minute, and then an overall words per minute for the entire set of 3 stories. This gives you an idea of the kind of data that we got in tryout for a single segment in question. So this shows for a 4th grade segment of 40 words in this case, the distribution of the amount of time that students spent on the screen looking at that segment before they went to the question. And the median time was 17 seconds, which is about 141 words per minute. And it's an interesting distribution in that we have a little bump down at the lower left between 0 and 10 seconds, which is rather suspicious. What is that about? The rest of the distribution looks like what you would normally expect. If we also show question accuracy, that is the percent of students who answered this particular question correctly, we see that below 10 seconds of reading time on the screen, accuracy for a 3-choice question is just about at chance level. And right at 10 seconds or so, that bumps up to the actual optimal level of close to 90% accuracy on this question. So this reinforces the notion that what we're seeing with this kind of a distribution of reading time is some students at the lower left who are really not reading the passage, who are rushing through it, and who are therefore not being accurate on the questions. What we've done to deal with that is to add a feature where the student cannot click next on a segment. That is, they must spend a certain minimum amount of time on the segment before moving to the question. And that minimum amount of time is specific to the particular segment, and because it's based on the data that we're looking, the kind of data we're looking at in this slide. So in this particular case, the next button would be disabled until 10 seconds had elapsed, because we know from this kind of information that students who click next before 10 seconds are virtually never really comprehending the passage. So that enabled eliminating that kind of spurious, very high words per minute. This is an indication of just how easy the questions are. I want to stress that this is not really a test of proficiency of comprehension. It is a test of rate of reading with comprehension, so the questions should be easy. And as you can see, this shows the number of correct out of a set of 4 questions associated with the story. And at grade 4, as you can see, the long bars for correct, most students were getting a perfect score on each story. We standardized this in the 2013-14 school year around the country. And the only other two new pieces of information on this slide, one is that on the 12 questions, which are 4 questions for each of 3 stories, in order to get a valid rate score, the student must have at least 9 of the 12 correct. And we found that the average administration time in standardization was 7.5 minutes. So it's a relatively brief administration, especially considering that it's self-administered. This gives an indication of its reliability, which is the consistency of the rate of reading across stories. So the rate of reading is highly consistent within an administration session on different stories. It's also fairly consistent across seasons. This is grade 4 between fall and winter, and you can see that there's a lot of consistency between the scores at the 2 times, so it has a fair bit of stability. It's not as stable as oral reading fluency is, which tends to be up in the upper 80s, but it's still a fairly stable measure. And this is a summary of that inter-season stability across the grade levels. And as you can see, this stability is consistent from grades 4 through 8. This shows a correlation of the rate score with various other measures. So in the first column, we're looking at the correlations between the silent reading fluency rate, words per minute, and oral reading fluency at that grade, which averages 61. Secondly, we have a comparison of scores with a passage comprehension test, which is part of the new Ames Web Plus, and comparing the predictive validity of the silent reading fluency with that of the oral reading fluency. And as you can see, silent reading fluency is a little lower than oral reading fluency against this criterion. And finally, correlations with a vocabulary measure, which is also part of Ames Web Plus. This illustrates the relationship of silent reading fluency words per minute to oral reading fluency words per minute, words correct per minute, at grade 4. And what this shows is the red line would be the equality line or the identity line. That is, the red line is where the rates are equal on the 2 measures. And the black line is the best fitting line that describes the data. And the data indicate that rates of reading are very similar between oral reading fluency and silent reading fluency across much of the range of performance. Sensitivity to growth is another critical feature or capability of any measure of fluency that's going to be used in progress monitoring. And what this is showing is comparing the sensitivity to growth and change in words per minute between fall and spring by grade, between oral reading fluency in red and silent reading fluency in blue. And as you can see, they're very similar in terms of the magnitude of the sensitivity to growth. Oral reading fluency is a little higher, but both of them are very strong relative to many tests that are available for use in tracking performance in growth in reading. The final piece of data I want to show you is just an illustration of the relationship between accuracy or comprehension accuracy and reading rate, and this is in particular grade 7. So in this chart, the blue lines bars show the number of students at each number of questions correct. So you can see that about half of the students at grade 7 in the fall were perfect on their questions, answered all the questions correctly. Another quarter of students answered 11 out of 12 correctly. So the great majority of students answered 11 or 12 correctly, or even, and if you looked at 9 to 12 correctly, which is a criterion, it's an overwhelming number of students who are at that level of accuracy. And in that range of accuracy, there's a positive relationship between rate and accuracy. So faster students tend to be more accurate. More accurate students tend to read more quickly within this range of reasonable comprehension accuracy. There are about 8% of students, and we've seen this in a number of different samples, it's a fairly consistent finding across grades, whose accuracy is low and for whom rate becomes quite high. And again, for these students, because they are not comprehending, rate is not really an indicator of their rate of reading with comprehension because of their poor comprehension. So these are students who are really moving through the text either without the ability or without the intention or effort to comprehend what they're reading. I want to summarize this portion simply by saying that the impetus for developing the silent reading fluency was to have a substitute for oral reading fluency that would be sensitive to growth, be a valid predictor of reading performance, be self-administered, and be a natural task, and have a comprehension requirement. We've learned through the research done through development and following development that comprehension-based silent reading rate is not the same as oral reading rate. The two are different. Silent reading fluency measures the rate at which the student reads while comprehending what they read as they read. So it's a real-time measure. It's not a measure of reading comprehension, rather it's a measure of the automaticity or efficiency of obtaining meaning from text. And with that mention of meaning, I want to turn it over to Dr. Hebert, who will talk about particular of the aspects, issues regarding comprehension.
Thank you so much, Mark, and also thank you so much for letting me be involved in this program of research. I want to be clear that I wasn't part of this brilliant design of this measure, which I think as an educator I've been looking for and waiting for a long time. I've been very, very interested in silent reading because if we think about it, that's the mode in which most of the college and career-ready reading is done. And it definitely is the manner in which we assess students with summative assessments. I want to be clear from the outset that when we're talking about silent reading rate with comprehension, we aren't talking about an effort to get kids at crazy high levels. What we're talking about, you know, some of you don't remember the Evelyn Wood movement in the 1950s and 60s when it was claimed that people could read with just enormously fast rates, and you'll probably have heard the joke by Woody Allen saying, you know, I read War and Peace in an evening and it was about war and peace. So that's not what we're talking about here. Students need to be able to be attending and monitoring and comprehending while they're reading silently, and we've long been waiting for a measure of silent reading fluency and comprehension, and this measure I think really achieves or fills the gap. Now this measure has also allowed me to do some research and gain some insight into who the struggling or the striving readers are, especially in the middle grades and high school. I often hear teachers talking about high school kids and saying things like, you know, I've got kids reading at the 3rd or 4th grade level. And I don't ever quite understand what that means. I've don't know, does that mean that they can only read third or fourth grade words, or what is it that happens when kids are silently reading? We haven't had, unless we're doing eye movements, and some of that work is also possible and helping to inform us. But this assessment, really getting into the results, has allowed me to ask and answer some questions. And so what I want to do to start out with here is to give you a scenario of what the typical American striving readers in the middle grades look like. So one of the things that we often don't talk about is that by the end of third grade, the level of oral reading word recognition accuracy is very, very high. So what I've got on the left here are students at the 50th, 25th, and 10th percentile. And what you're seeing is that by the end of third grade, even the kids in the 10th percentile are reading higher than 90% with 90% accuracy. 90% is the level that Mari Clay from Reading Recovery is always given as a target. That's been a long-standing level in terms of clinical work. But what we're seeing, and by the way, the 25th and 50th percentile reached these similar levels already at the end of second grade. So our students are able to recognize words. They do it slowly, very slowly in some cases, and this is from Dibbles, this isn't necessarily the most accurate or valid kind of comprehension assessment, but it does give an indication that students really aren't able to summarize or talk about what it is that they've read. So the first point that I really want to make is that we have students who can recognize words. A lot of our interventions focus on word recognition. Now, I'm not saying that they don't need to read more rapidly. They do, but I'm going to give you some examples of why the cycle keeps going round and round and round. We know that when they get to a silent reading comprehension task, and this is from the National Assessment, the distribution is typically a third advanced, proficient, a third basic, and a third below. Okay, so when they actually are, and by the way, these are all, when I was talking about the Dibbles work here, this is all with grade level texts. And the Dibbles and the National Assessment have some very similar text levels. So when they get to silent reading, not just in the retelling from Dibbles, but also on the NAEP, they do poorly. Now, one of the things that this silent reading fluency measure that Mark talked about has allowed us to do is it's allowed us to look at the kids who are participating in this rapid reading or who are comprehending so poorly, and we know that they're actually reading very slowly. So one of the things that we've done recently is we gave them an online assessment that Mark showed you, and then we gave similar passages to them in a one-to-one setting with paper and pencil. And what you see here is that, and this includes kids who were reading very, very rapidly and without comprehension. All of these kids were poor comprehenders. But what you see is their rate goes down in the one-to-one setting, and their comprehension goes up substantially. What point am I making here? The point that I'm making is that when they absolutely need to, most of our students, and by the way, this was at 6th grade, can read. And these were kids who, were classified as being very much in the category of striving readers. They can read, but the task is so tedious for them that when left in their own devices, they don't read. They engage in really dysfunctional kinds of behaviors. Now, I'm going to argue that one of the big reasons for this, excuse me for a minute, I have a case of asthma. One of the big reasons for this is that a lot of our students just aren't doing that much reading. So in a recent study as part of the Reading for Understanding, we see that in middle through high school classes, 15% of English language arts classes were actually spent in reading. That's actually probably not bad, but when we look at what that reading looked like, it turned out that only a small proportion of that reading, about 1.65 minutes a day, was actually spent silent reading. The bulk of the reading time was spent following along to either the teacher reading aloud or somebody else in the class reading aloud. That's a very hard way to get better at silent reading. So what we see then is this scenario that Mark described for you, where we have on the left-hand side, we have a group of kids, and I'm counting now the moderate comprehension students are the ones that were getting 9 to 11 on this assessment. The assessment is that this comprehension, I mean, 11 might be okay, but 9 and 10 already is a moderate level of comprehension. So I've classified those, and again, this is a profile of a 6th grade cohort from the large-scale assessment that Mark described. So what we're seeing, and in this particular cohort, the level was just a tad bit lower than the 8%. It was actually 5%, and we see another 5% that is reading very slowly. These kids just keep going at the same rate, even when they're not comprehending, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon. Then here in the middle, we've got some kids who are very, very slow. We also have some very slow readers, and by slow, I'm talking about kids who read silently slower than they read orally. So they're actually reading very, very slow. Some of those kids are comprehending, others have moderate comprehension. But I want to talk about, because I know many of you are asking, what kinds of things can we do about this? I'm saying that this new measure allows us to get a profile of what students look like. I think for middle schoolers and high school students, knowing how you're reading silently is a really important piece of information. At this point, this is a measure for middle school kids, so I'm actually saying being aware of these patterns I think are important. There are some other things that I'm going to suggest that we can do. I think this issue, I call it stamina. Boy, I keep jumping back to that slide for some reason. I'm calling it an issue of stamina. Stamina, being willing to stay with the task, even when the text is hard, is the biggest obstacle that we have right now in terms of achieving standards in reading. So I want to give you 3 ideas for how we can respond to this situation. One I've alluded to, and that is with middle school kids and middle graders, kids in grades 3, 4, 5, we need to have conversations with them about this pattern and helping them to recognize, you know, these are the words in the text, and this is a short passage up here in this corner that I'm pointing to from the Park assessment, one of the trial passages. And the yellow words are words that are very, very frequent in English, written English. The purple words are less frequent. I've actually created a crib sheet for teachers called Talking Points for Teachers to just give you some modeling for how we can have conversations with students. But we need to have conversations with students. You know, this, what was I saying? You know, about 60% of the kids who have moderate comprehension or very, very poor comprehension. And they need to be aware that the majority of the words in texts are words that with which they're fluent, at least in decoding. They need to read more to develop the fluency that underlies comprehension. But they also need to realize that whenever you see a new text, any topic is going to bring up some new vocabulary. But when we look at that vocabulary, often you have the strategies in the background to figure those words out. So this is a task you can do, but it's a task that you steadily need to work on. Okay, so that's the very important first idea. The second idea, and especially as we're thinking now at this time of the year about summative assessments, I'm going to suggest that we need to give students many consistent opportunities to read magazine articles. I'm not saying that you don't read short stories, long novels, different kinds of informational text, but I'm really part of a recommendation that is read at least one good magazine article a day in school. Why? Lots and lots of different reasons. But for one, a magazine article actually gives you most of the background knowledge that you need to understand a particular idea. It also helps you use texts to develop background knowledge, which is what the whole close reading movement is about. Okay, so you want to read a lot to get good at background knowledge. It turns out that when we talk to the poor comprehenders that I described earlier, that poor comprehender study, it turned out that these students actually identified topics as what made text easy or hard for them. So one of the things that we want to do is help kids get a plethora of topics in which they know something. Okay, so magazine articles are really, really an important part. I think a warm-up in a class in the middle grades, in the middle school, on a daily basis, a magazine article. And there are places where you can get open access, free materials. One of them is my website. These texts have been written to have a higher than typical percentage of the very core words, the ones that I had marked in yellow on the previous slide. These are words that kids really need to be very, very fast with so that they can figure out the rare words that don't occur as often. So there are about 100 of these texts available for free download. You can use them in your classrooms as often and as much as you want. Another site is readworks.org that has about 1,600 articles. And one of the things I like about this site is that there are different texts on the same topic, allowing you to give kids at least a modicum of choice in what they want to read. And for middle graders, that's a really big part of engagement. Okay, so you read the article on the left, other people read the article on the right. Now we have 2 more articles, so within this whole class, we've got 4 articles going, and we actually have a valid reason to interact with each other as we share this information. So this idea that you need to read more and also read widely is a really critical one. That isn't to say that you don't also need to read full-length novels and so on, but I really do want to emphasize that magazine reading helps you get ready for a particular genre. It helps you develop background knowledge, and it also can really help you with the automaticity you need in silent reading, and also staying with the task, because these tasks aren't incredibly onerous. Now, this is a doable task, and for a striving reader who has a pattern of doing this rapid reading that we talked about, or plugging along really slowly and then pretty much giving up, but just staying with the eyes on the text and then answering the questions. For those kids, this is a manageable task. I do want to make a comment about a new phenomenon that's out there, which are sets of texts with different Lexile levels. And the claim is made that you have the same content, but with different Lexile levels. I want you to take a look at the text of different Lexile levels in red. And what you see here consistently in all 3 of these programs, so it's red, black, and the checkered, those are all 3 different programs with 4 different Lexile levels. When the programs had 10 or 11 Lexile levels, I clumped them into these 4 groups. But what you're seeing here is that the very lowest readers always get the least amount of text. And sometimes the amount, like in Program C, is so small that it doesn't teach you anything about stamina. Okay? I don't know where the philosophy came about that you would get better at something by doing less of it. Dick Ellington, about 40 years ago, said, if they don't read much, how are they ever going to get good? And the point is that unless there's a very aggressive way to make sure that kids very quickly move to higher Lexile levels, this is an effort that I think can guarantee that we're going to keep the lower kids in the very same place that they are and not developing the stamina that they need. By the way, the difference in vocabulary at these different levels is not significant. What is different is the sentence length. And it turns out just changing sentence length doesn't help the struggling readers. They also need an incredible amount of support with ideas, which comes to the third idea, and that is looking at text as a way to get new information. Text is where human beings store information, and unless I as a student know that and am good at accessing information, I'm never going to be good at reading, and a lot of the largesse of the information age is going to be lost to me. We need to, the reason we're doing all this reading is so that you can learn things. And we want students, especially the ones who haven't made a habit of reading, who've had a very poor experience over time. We want them to see what it is that they can learn from text. And what I suggest is collecting, having knowledge notebooks in classrooms and collecting lots and lots of content maps, word maps, whatever you want to call these semantic maps. But when I've read a collection of articles about immigration, I actually summarize them in a way that makes sense for me. Here's some other examples. You can do this with diagrams. You can do this with pictures. We have some sets at Text Project. We have a whole set of pictures and word maps, semantic maps, around about 20 topics. And this one on fashion and design gives you an example. I want to have a collection of concepts that I've learned and that I can review and that I can remember. And that helps me realize that this process of reading isn't just to get through with the task, which is what a lot of the poor comprehenders thought it was, but it is to remember and know things from it. So I hope you visit me at Text Project. Everything at Text Project is open access, and now it's time for us to answer some questions.
Great.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, well, we have had some questions come in. Here's the first one. What do you do if you are administering SRF and the student doesn't get the 9 of 12 to get a WPM score?
Wonderful question, and that has been preoccupying us and the focus of much of our work. At present, we would recommend there are two ways to go. One is the more straightforward way, and that is to give oral reading fluency as an alternative, because one is to give oral reading fluency as an alternative and to use that score in its place, because it is a useful score, and even a student who doesn't display comprehension can provide valid information through oral reading fluency. The other, which is something we're experimenting and exploring with about now, is to see if there are ways of administering silent reading fluency, again, perhaps in a one-on-one administration, as Freddie mentioned, where that seems to make a difference in terms of getting the student to invest the effort to comprehend and therefore to get a valid indicator of rate with comprehension.
I'm going to add a comment also that, from my perspective, this is a really critical piece of information for teacher and student. So if I'm not attending in this task, and what we're seeing here is we've got a persistent group of American kids who do this, and I've done some previous studies where we see this, and we need to let these kids actually talk about what the obstacles are. And, you know, especially when you're in middle grades and middle school, what does this mean for you? You can read. We recognize that it's tedious, and we're going to also give you some interventions to support you so that it gets less tedious. So I think that to me is, it's an important piece of information. I realize that people want norms, but to me it's an important part of the reading diagnosis.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, here's our next question. Are there different scales of silent reading fluency in English for English learners?
At present, we only have the English version. So there's nothing in this particular measure. It's currently in English only.
Okay. The other projects that I've seen have also been, I haven't seen any norming for English learners.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, here's another question. Can you talk a bit more about how this measure contributes to an overall score of comprehension?
The AIMSweb Plus system does create an overall composite score, which is based on 3 pieces. One is a passage comprehension test, which is a Common Core type standards-based passage comprehension test. Secondly, a reading vocabulary test, and thirdly, the silent reading fluency. So those 3 scores go into an overall composite that is intended to be a strong predictor of external criteria such as state testing scores. I wouldn't say that from an interpretive point of view, we feel that these are best interpreted individually. So silent reading fluency with comprehension is itself a construct, which is not the same thing as performance on a passage comprehension test, which is based more on a standards-based model. So I hope that answers. There is a way of getting a composite, but from in terms of getting an insight into the students' reading characteristics and skills and weaknesses, it's best to interpret them separately.
Yeah, I would underscore that also, that this is really a diagnostic tool, so it helps us to understand. So that this is why when I started out in looking at the data, for example, on the National Assessment of Educational Progress or a profile on a state assessment of a school or a classroom, we don't know what it means to be in the below basic group. Does that mean you can't read at all? What we're seeing here is that isn't what it means. It often means that when you get to a silent reading task, you have very poor stamina. And to me, that's a very important part of not saying this is the comprehension measure. It's saying this is learning more about your behaviors when you're reading silently.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, here's our next question. What are some technology-based assessments that can be used to test for silent reading fluency?
Well, the AIMSweb Silent Reading Fluency test. Others?
I personally haven't seen another measure like this. Yeah. So when you ask what are some web-based, what are some assessments that give this kind of information this quickly, I don't know of any other ones. But I'm sure that somebody in the audience will let me know, which I would greatly appreciate. Mark, do you know? I don't know of anything else.
I don't know of any, right. I mean, there are some other measures that take different approaches to measuring silent reading fluency. Maze type tasks is one. There are others such as the slashing task where you put marks between sets of letters without spaces, sentence verification tasks, and so on. They're not particularly technology based, and they're all very different approaches, and one of the challenges in this area is to have a measure of silent reading comprehension with silent reading fluency with comprehension that uses a natural or authentic approach to reading as opposed to these other tasks which are somewhat unnatural or artificial.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to my theme here. I think I'm hearing something pretty consistent in what I'm saying, but even like the maze task, it isn't giving you the kind of information that you're getting here in terms of basing an instructional program, and that's why I was actually applying some of these findings to say we're getting a really clear profile from this work as to what it is that the kids are and aren't doing. You know, some of them are simply not doing the task. Some of them are doing it and reading fairly fast. Remember the group of kids in the middle there with the moderate comprehension. Some of those kids are reading pretty quickly and not comprehending particularly well. So I don't know of another measure, when I say I don't know of another measure, that provides educators with this kind of information that you can actually intervene on.
All right, thank you. Okay, here's our next question. How young of a student can silent reading be used?
This test starts at grade 4, and the reasons for that, we did try it out at the spring of grade 2 and found that it was did not seem to be close to really being appropriate for that grade level in its current form. And so because of that, we inferred that it would not be appropriate for the full span of students at the beginning of grade 3, which is when these tests have to be able to be functional, that is at the beginning of the school year. So the earliest at which this really covers the full range of students is grade 4 currently. I think it's, there are some ideas about how this might be brought down to grade 3 or 2 in the future.
Okay. I was going to ask that, Mark, because it seems to me with at least, some of these next generation assessments, kids are being asked to, perform in a digital environment in grade 3. So it seems to me that having some information on kids' performances at that point might be useful.
Right, and I think that the challenge will be to structure the presentation of the instructions and the feedback so that students really understand what they're supposed to do. That is, that they're supposed to read for meaning, and it's transitioning away from demonstrating that they can read, but reading for meaning, and that was sort of the stumbling block that we ran into originally, but with effort, I'm sure it could be, or we hope that it could be done.
I think letting kids know how they've done after the first passage, after the second passage, I think that was a brilliant part of your design. Because I don't know if some of them changed their behaviors, but it seems to me that develops some consciousness when they're doing the task.
Okay. All right, here's our next question. What is the practicality of implementing SRF on a one-to-one basis with paper? My concern is keeping time for each of the 12 passages.
It's very easy. As I said, we did that in pilot testing. You essentially let the student turn pages, and you simply keep a stopwatch running and just jot down at each page turn the number of the elapsed time at that point. So it's really quite simple.
Okay, great. Okay, here's another question. How do you gain access to this program? Is there a cost to the district?
Well, it's part of the Ames Web system, which is a whole series of curriculum-based measures. It's part of the new generation of Ames Web measures called Ames Web Plus, and I'm afraid I'm not the right person to talk about your question. I would have to suggest that you give a call to customer service, or if you can get information to me, I would pass it on to someone who could talk with you.
Okay. Okay.
Do you think there's ever going to be a plan to just have the silent reading fluency with comprehension measure available? That isn't part of the...
I don't know.
You're just a scientist, right?
That's right.
You just create these wonderful things.
Okay. All right. And then lastly, are there any additional points that you'd like to discuss?
Well, I would say in summary, I was absolutely delighted when I was introduced to this measure. As a researcher and as a teacher educator, the profile that I described that started out my presentation today, I didn't know some of these things 2 years ago when I started working on this project. In other words, I wasn't aware of this pattern that this persistent group of students will actually do quite well on an oral reading accuracy measure. And they also, if you're sitting there with them, can do the silent reading. So to me, it's just, I think, a brilliant design and fills an incredible gap that we've had. Because as I've written about, as I've talked about a lot, stamina to me is the issue. American kids, a large chunk of them, I think that's the issue that they really face. They just, it's tedious, they haven't read that much, and they just don't want to do it.
I would say that the horizons for important research just continue to expand because as we realize that what we're looking at is a measure that relates to the efficiency of the students being able to obtain information from print, which is so critical to both their academic life and their life in general. And this is something that really, as Freddie was saying, has not really been done previously, largely because the technology hasn't lent itself, hasn't been available to support this. So it's continues to be extremely exciting to see the kinds of questions that we should try to answer in getting at how people comprehend while they're reading.
Great. Okay. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Hebert and Dr. Daniel. We appreciate you being here, and thank you to all the attendees that have joined us for this session. Please take a moment at the end of this webinar to give your feedback in the survey provided. A follow-up message and link to the recording of this webinar will be emailed out to all participants within a few days. Feel free to share with your colleagues. Thank you for your time and have a great afternoon.